Við þökkum Unu og Ara kærlega fyrir. Mér langar til að koma á framfæri við fundin að allt þetta efni, þetta ítarlega efni hefur verið gert aðgengilegt á vef bankans frá með núna morgninum. En við höldum úti öflugri umræðu á umræðuvef bankans. Þar finnið þið mikið af fréttum frá bankanum, greiningar og annað sem þess virði að skoða. Einnig eru við að tísta frá fundinum undir myllumerkinu Hagspá. Þannig að það hægt að fylgjast með okkur þannig. Einnig erum við líka að taka upp þennan fund og munum birta allt þetta efni núna strax eftir fundin. Nú það komið að því að horfa vel út fyrir landsteinina. Þegar eins og kom fram í málinu hans Daniels hérna áðan, þá skiptir auðvitað staðan á alþjóðamörkuðum okkur miklu máli. Heimsfréttirnar þær hreinlega dynja á okkur og ef maður ætlar að fylgjast vel með þá þarf maður allavega í það minnst að vera virkur á Twitter. Við höfum fengið mjög góðan gest til okkar and I would like to welcome our guest, Jamie Russ. He is Bloomberg's chief economist for Europe. He was prior to joining Bloomberg a senior economist for the British government. The title of his presentation is The Economic Consequences of Populism. Við höfum þýtt þetta þannig efnahagslegar afleiðingar populisma. Jamie, I would like to welcome you to the stage.
Well, good morning, everyone. I can't claim to have understood every single word I've heard this morning, but it sounds like the economy is getting bigger and your houses are getting smaller. So I'm not sure what's wrong there, but maybe that's something to fix. So today I'm going to talk about populism. And it's a real pleasure to be here. In fact, it's just a pleasure to be anywhere but Britain at the moment. There are one or two things going on there, which I may get into a little bit later. So just start with this slide. Now, there's no kind of universally accepted definition of populism, but I think when you see a populist government, you know what a populist government is. So we have kind of created a chart which illustrates the proportion of the G20 economy, which is run by populists. Or rather than the rise of populism, we should really call this like the ebbing away of the establishment. So if you look back to the 80s, 70% of the G20 economy was run by the establishment. Now that's around about 30%. So you can see in the blue bar, that's a gentleman who's entered the White House recently. The white bar isn't actually a change in regime. It's just that China is just becoming much larger as a share of the G20 economy. So you can see that's getting bigger. Clearly, this doesn't capture the whole picture. There's lots of smaller economies where things are changing. Hungary, for example, is a cause of concern. But so I thought I'd think a little bit about the causes of this. I'm only going to talk about the economics ones because I'm an economist. But one of the main ones is that the rich have just got richer. So this is the share of income going to the top 10%, and it's how it's changed since 1980 and up to 2015. And you can see it's kind of broadly spread. It's happening in most places. Some places is kind of more obvious, like Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union has obviously transferred a lot. That's a bit of an outlier. But generally speaking, we see this trend all over the world. What's less well understood is that company inequality is increasing as well. So this is an analysis that we did, I think it was a year ago now, looking at Bloomberg data for the return on invested capital for the 1,500 largest companies in the US. And what it shows is the rate of return by decile. So the line at the top is the rate of return for the companies, the top 10% of companies in the US. And you can see they're earning huge rates of return, whereas previously in the late 90s they weren't. It was a much more closely packed set of firms. So what we've seen is that this is really widened over recent years. We also looked to see whether that was the case in Europe. And when we looked at the data, that's true in Europe as well. So we saw that there was this rising disparity between companies in Europe as well as the US. And then we thought we'd have a look everywhere else, and we see the same thing. It's not quite the same degree, but we see the same trend. So there are some companies out there which are reaping a lot of returns, and lots of companies which aren't. And it's more like it's a kind of winner-takes-all market now. The Googles, the Facebooks, the large companies that have an immediate that get in there first, take all the proceeds, and that's manifested in a huge rate of return. So there are haves and have-nots, both people and companies. The other thing that's changed over the last 40 years is the deunionization of the labor force. This is just shows the US, the proportion of unionization in the workforce, that's the yellow line, and the rise in inequality is the green line. So I won't dwell on that. But one of the biggest things that's changed, and I think is one of the major drivers of populism, is the change in the composition of the global labor supply. So what this chart shows is the global labor supply by education level. And there's one thing that you can see very clearly in the chart, it's the purple line, and that is a huge influx of workers educated to a secondary level, so high school sort of level. And this is associated with the integration of China into the global workforce. So we know that that has happened. We know it has created a huge amount of pressure on blue-collar workers, particularly in the US, but Europe as well. But that phase has sort of come to an end. The integration is finishing, it's not getting bigger. But that was phase one. Phase two is the integration of tertiary workers into the global labour supply, which is the yellow line. And this is university-educated, it's graduates, and again, it's particularly in China, but India as well. And so if the narrative over the last 30 years was China has come for your blue-collar workers, the narrative over the next 20, 30 years is that China is coming for your white-collar jobs. And I look around the room and I see a few white collars, not to alarm you. But this is going to be one of the dominant trends over the next couple of decades. So if we look at the causes, at least on the economics side, they're not going to change. So we do not see a reunionization of the workforce. We are not going to see a change in the labour supply back to what it was. If anything, it's going to bring new challenges. Technology is going to continue advancing, and the companies that reap the benefits are going to continue to reap the benefits. We don't see Google or Facebook being broken up, not in the near term anyway. And then there's a whole load of other stuff which just isn't in my remit to talk about, but the unbundling of media, the rise of social media. My impression is that it's probably not going to become a lot more truthful over the next few years. And so our feeling is populism, or the causes of it, are going to be with us for some time. And of course, that has consequences. These are two consequences. I'm not going to dwell on that slide, but I'm going to start. I'll take them in turn. So we'll talk about Brexit first, and then the trade war. So you may be thinking, who are the biggest victims of Brexit? Is it the people who voted for it and didn't know what they were going to get? No, it's graphic design. That is one of the greatest tragedies of Brexit, is that things are moving so fast that I have to make things in Microsoft Paint. In fact, even that's not fast enough, because we are no longer where I say we are, which is where I sent the slides a couple of days ago. We're now somewhere on the right side here, heading towards this middle point where there's an election. There will be an election in the UK in the middle of December. Now, if you were hoping that was going to clear everything up, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. So there are three possible outcomes. One is that the Conservative Party, who are in power at the moment, win. And then you think, oh, well, at least that'll draw a line under things. No, it won't. So there are then two options after this. You see, they either have to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU, and these normally take 4 years to negotiate, so allowing yourself 9 months is probably not going to be enough. And then you end up with a new cliff edge at the end of 2020. This is our base case, that the Conservatives win, and then we have a huge number of extensions beyond 2020 while this free trade agreement's negotiated. The other possibility is that the opposition, or some combination of opposition parties, takes over. Then we think there'll be a customs union with the EU or a second referendum. And again, there's no clarity as to where the eventual outcome will be. If there's a hung parliament, so if the same people come back that we've just sent out, then we're in trouble, because there's no clear path forward if the election doesn't deliver a firm verdict one way or the other. So uncertainty is going to be with us. The differences between different trading arrangements are very large for the UK. So when the way we do it at Bloomberg is we have a gravity model of the UK, looking at all its trade flows and we try and understand what drives those trade flows, and it's normally things like size, common language, and other things. And we can therefore estimate the impact of different trading arrangements on the economy. And so what we find, these are all the things that have roughly been talked about in recent years, but the point is that the difference between them is about 6% of GDP in the medium term, which is quite a lot for an advanced economy. We already know that Brexit is having a large effect on the economy, even though the trading arrangements haven't changed. And this is because uncertainty is very high, businesses are just holding back on investment. And what this chart shows is the level of investment in the UK, which is the yellow line, and the level of investment everywhere else, which is the white line. And you can see that everywhere else is doing quite well, and the UK is not doing very well at all. So the effects are already being felt, and they're going to continue to be felt. The economy is going to grow more slowly than its peers. So we can also use this gravity model I described to estimate the impact of different trading arrangements all over the globe. So we look at the EU's relationships, we look at the US relationships, and that allows us to get some context on how big Brexit is relative to the other things that are going on in the world. So the impact of a hard Brexit on trade flows is around about $110 billion a year, we think. Compare that to the introduction of tariffs between the US and China, and it's quite a bit smaller, but it's still quite big. So if the current tariffs that are in place, we think would reduce trade flows by 200 to 250 billion. If all the threatened tariffs are implemented as well, then it rises to about 350 billion. So Brexit is about one third as bad as the US-China trade war could be. But still, for a small economy in the globe, that's quite large. In some ways, Brexit is kind of like it's a microcosm for what's going on in the rest of the world. It's like a little example of how things are manifest themselves globally. So what this chart shows is global policy uncertainty, and of course it's up because the US trade policy is highly uncertain. And this is having an effect on business investment, just as it did in the UK, but on a less pronounced sort of level. So we see that business investment globally was growing at about 5% a year. Now it's down to nothing. So this has had quite a big effect on demand. And this is our global GDP tracker. So we look at the global economy in real time, and you can see it's ticked down. And we think it's probably going to be a little bit slower than even the IMF thought when they published their forecast a couple of weeks ago. But this leads me, that sounds quite miserable. There is some possible upside here, and I'm going to show you what it is. So we have a global economic model at Bloomberg, which we use to estimate the impacts of shocks on the economy. And what we have here is two shocks. We have the direct effect of tariffs on global GDP, and we have the increase in uncertainty. So we've got these two things, we can measure them, and we can measure their impact on the economy. And so what we think has happened so far is this. We think that the biggest effect on global GDP has not come from the trade tariffs themselves, but from uncertainty around them. So the uncertainty shock is larger than the trade shock, which leads me to one fairly important conclusion, which is that if uncertainty does recede, the economy can start growing more quickly, even if all the tariffs that are currently in place stay in place. So you don't need tariffs to go away, you just need uncertainty about them to disappear. And that's not going to be, we're not expecting uncertainty to go completely. As long as Trump's in the White House, there will always be uncertainty over trade. But the latest signs are that uncertainty is receding. The relationship between China and the US is starting to simmer down. The US has realized conducting trade wars across the globe is damaging to its own economy and is now less willing to engage in a trade war with China. So we're hoping that that's going to prevent a big trade war erupting with Europe and that things gradually calm down. So we also know that the trade war, Brexit, and this possible threat of European tariffs affects different economies in different ways. And so what we have done is we have looked at all the spillovers to trade from these three shocks to the different economies in the world. So this means that we're not just looking at who exports stuff to the US. That's not a complete measure. It's of the stuff that's imported to the US from Germany, what comes from other countries in Europe. So if you've got a German car manufacturer, if BMW is selling cars in the US, it's not just the steel that's going to disappear, it's the advertising revenue and all this other stuff from the companies that feed into it. So we've calculated all these spillovers, And we see that the economies most exposed are obviously Britain because of Brexit, but we see Germany, China obviously, US to a lesser extent. Norway, that's just misleading really because it's to do with oil exports to the UK. But this pattern is reflected in the PMIs that we see globally. So if you're looking for if we're looking for where the slowdown is occurring most, it's occurring most in Germany. It's happening in Turkey, although for other reasons, and we're seeing it in China as well. And just in the hard data, the actual GDP data that we have, we see it there too. So if you look at the southwest of this chart, that's not a place you want to be. You want to be in the northeast of this chart because that's where you're accelerating growth relative to last year and relative to your trend. If you're at the bottom left of this chart, you're slowing down, and you're slowing down well below your trend rate over the past 10 years. And you can see that China's there, Germany's there, South Korea's there. Some of the places you'd expect these spillovers to manifest are being affected quite badly. So I would say that the populism is having a very, very profound effect on the global economy. I think that some of the worst bits that are occurring with the current round of populism are probably going to ease over the next year. So we're expecting the economic outlook for Europe to stabilize. We're not expecting a big rebound, but we're expecting it to stabilize. We're seeing very, very early evidence in the German business surveys that there is stabilization occurring, or at least things are not getting worse anymore. So that is a source of some source of comfort. And if we see a mini deal between China and the US over the next few weeks, then I think uncertainty is going to come down, and the confidence will gradually be restored. And so we're expecting GDP growth to gradually recover through 2020 for Europe. Germany is in itself slightly different in that it has big structural challenges. We know that the autos industry is very substantial proportion of output in Germany, especially when you take into account those intermediate things that occur in Germany that feed into that business. And it's going through a time of structural change. There will be a movement away from the sorts of vehicles that it's been producing towards less polluting vehicles, and this will be a large adjustment for the German economy. Which leads me to kind of think a bit about where populism might strike next. So I think Germany has had its brush with populism already, but I think it would be quite foolish to think that that's gone away completely. If the German economy continues to grow very slowly, I think that when Merkel leaves in a year's time, there is a serious risk that populism will regain a foothold in Germany. But there are other countries as well. So we've just published this huge report looking at all the main drivers of economic growth across the world, but also the disruptors of growth as well. So things like populism, exposure to technological progress, exposure to automation, and we've combined all those into a global index. And you can find those on the Bloomberg terminal. If you email me, I can send you the report directly. But this is just a snippet of it, and just looking at a very small subcomponent, looking at populism. You can see that some of the economies that are at most risk of populism are some of the most indebted, and we see Italy there, we see Spain there, we still see Greece there, of course. These are countries that are still extremely at risk of populist change, and this could potentially have very big consequences. As I said, we expect the Eurozone to straight through and to continue growing next year. If, on the other hand, we're completely wrong about the tariffs and the eye of Sauron spins over to Europe instead of China, then I think that Europe's going to be in for an extremely difficult time. The biggest risk, I think, is that they put autos tariffs on Germany, which would prompt a recession in Germany. We're almost certain of that. And we think there's a risk then that it could spill over to the rest of the Eurozone. If you create these sort of destabilizing influences at a time when populism is on the rise, then I think we could be in for another crisis in a year or two's time. Anyway, it's not the base case. The base case is that Trump will see sense and back down a bit before the 2020 election. So I'll leave you to enjoy this report. Go and find it. Email me. If you want to find the home of economics research on the Bloomberg terminal. Just type those 4 letters in, and they will lead you to me and to my team. And that's it. So enjoy the rest of the conference, and yeah, do get in touch if you're interested in economics.